All right, Horns at Half Pass brought to you by Dr. Greg Eckert. Here's the challenge for Sark. Now, we've talked about what Kurt Cignetti kind of taught everybody and his Indiana team and the way they built that roster. It's not all talent, and I don't think there's anybody that's paying attention that doesn't think Texas, through this transfer portal, has upgraded the talent on the roster, the explosiveness on the roster. I mean, you talk about bringing in a Cam Coleman and the two running backs who are big plays waiting to happen, and you talk about Rasheem Biles on defense, who's an explosive playmaking linebacker, Bo Masco, an all Big Ten corner. I mean, you're talking about you've upgraded the talent. You bring in a walk-in starter at right tackle in Melvin Siani from Wake Forest, who the Texas coaches thinks an NFL draft pick coming up in 2027. He takes over right tackle. That allows you to slide Brandon Baker inside. Now your real question mark position is left guard. But you're better. You're more talented than you were headed into the offseason last year. And you're more veteran because a lot of these really good young players like Colin Simmons and Arch Manning are coming back. But it's about the culture, right? Sark has kind of lived on that of how we remember when he first got here and they went 5-7 and they had to root out the ones that didn't want to be here. And they built around Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson, and those guys set the culture, which, remember when he said we had 2 or 3 great leaders that first year, then we had 10 or 12. Jalen Ford and Jahdae Barron and these guys, and Kelvin Banks started to become the leaders of the football team. And by the year that they moved into the SEC and played in the championship game, they had a whole locker room full of leadership. And then this year, with a lot of that leadership that walked off to the NFL and got drafted and moved on, and come back with a lot of young, inexperienced players, the year wasn't as good. But the culture, Sark said, was that's why they went 3-2 and stuck together, right? Able to go 6-1 down the stretch, win a bowl game. He talked about his culture. Well, now you've had 24 players walk out the door. You're losing another crop to the NFL, about 8 or 9. So over 30 players are out. About between probably 40 new guys coming in, 16 through the portal, 20 plus, just over 20 coming in from the high school ranks. So you're moving on from about 35. You're adding about 35 into the mix. So how do you keep the culture? Listen to Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban is an Indiana alum, and he was all over the place on Monday night and throughout this playoff run for his Hoosiers. But listen to him talking about culture and how they, as an athletic department, from the AD down, wanted to make sure they were keeping the culture that Kurt Cignetti was building because it's not all about talent. Here's Mark Cuban.
It's a great question. I talked to Scott Dolson, who should be AD of the year on the planet, and we talked about that specific thing. The minute you start chasing the most expensive people coming out of the portal, you lose your identity. You lose your culture, because every other guy who came into the program sees that. Why are they chasing him and bidding him up, and they didn't do that for me? Why is it now about 5 stars as opposed to the blue-collar, hard-working guys? Because you know what it's like. All you guys do.
All right, so he went on to talk about the Mavericks and roster building, and let's just make sure we say that, because what he said can be right, but Kurt Cignetti brought in a bunch of hard-working dudes and a bunch of James Madison guys. If Indiana had gone out and started chasing a bunch of 5-star guys, that's a different scenario than Sark, because Sark in his locker room already has a bunch of 5-star guys, right? That were already here, who are pretty well compensated to begin with. Colin Simmons and the guys we've talked about, right? Trevor Gooseby. So that's him talking about Indiana. That when they had the great first year, let's be careful not to go out and chase stars and chase big money and bring in these guys, because you will upset this culture balance. Sark already has a bunch of those type of guys in the locker room. That's by high school recruiting and by design. But it is true that Sark really hasn't chased big dollar players in the portal until this year. So he listened to Mack Brown, former Texas coach, on his podcast, along with Bob Ballou and Vince Young, talking about this is the number one job for Steve Sarkisian and the staff now, building the culture, building the leadership, and defining roles.
So as soon as that portal's over on the 16th, they've got to start building culture and team and leadership. And how does Coleman fit in that room? Vince knows now. I mean, Vince was one of the best leaders I've ever seen, maybe the best. And he pulled locker rooms together. Arch seems to be doing some of that same thing, but all of this now has to pull stuff together. But I think, Vince, that's the thing that has to happen now. You get the pieces, and then you got to put them together. And one of the biggest things, they said Ryan Wingo was the lead recruiter on Cam Coleman. That has to work that way for it to work in the locker room. Right. Because if Wingo's mad because Cam's coming, then that doesn't work. But the more good players you got, the more people get the ball.
Okay, you got Coleman coming in. I have no idea about this kid, but I'm looking at his numbers. That's all fine and dandy, but that is gone. That happened. That's history. Now you got to figure out, like what Coach just said, like what you're going to do when you get here on campus to get on the same page as this coach over here? Or are you going to be a guy that's, to me, what it looks like to me is an I guy? Okay, that's just my opinion. So are you going to come here ready to work with me as a quarterback? Whatever you can help teach the younger, some of the guys that's here, how can we bring this all together so we can go try to compete for a championship game?
All right, so interesting from Vince Young and Mack Brown from the Stampede, and it's true. I mean, again, it's a more talented roster. It's a pretty expensive roster. But to I think Vince and Mack's point that, it was Arch Manning and Ryan Wingo kind of leading the recruitment of Cam Coleman. Like they really, were part of that. So that you have to feel like, but Cam Coleman's got to come in and buy in. Yeah. He's got to come in and understand what he is. And really to what Mack said at the beginning, that Vince is one of the best leaders ever been around. The strongest leader in that locker room that's not a coach has to be Arch Manning.
Which it feels like we're seeing him develop that, at least from the outside point of view. And then also, I just think it's a great point that Coach makes there about how Ryan Wingo recruiting him or bringing him in, you know what I mean? Being the number one recruiter for him is massive because, listen, wide receivers, two guys that want to be in the NFL, they kind of have this perception they could be divas to an extent, and they want the football and they want to make the play. But if they can work together, just like what we saw with Dallas, we kind of make that comparison here of what that did when CeeDee Lamb was on the field for the Cowboys. Adding George Pickens, if he can be that guy or vice versa, like that's going to be massive for this offense and totally buy in. But the leadership needs to be there. That's it, right? What happened in the past is the past. They're not going to have three different quarterbacks going in like that at Auburn for Cam Coleman. They rotated through a lot of guys and their coach is now gone. So there's stability here. And how will he perform under that? Can he just, fit that role of being the guy? That's the wide receiver one or whatever it might be, but also be okay with other guys getting the football. It comes down to that.
And that's on Sark. That's on this staff. That's on the leadership of the team. A lot of good players, and no one's sitting here saying they can't do it. But at the same time, that's now the challenge is bringing this group together and putting egos aside. It's a we thing, not an I thing. Me or I. I mean, there has to be that. And that's, Sark's been pretty strong at that. And I do think, as I've said quite a bit, not to be too personal with Sark, but there were a lot of challenges for him in the offseason of last year personally. I think part of that's why he brought in Will Muschamp, who's been a good builder of cultures, especially on defense. And that's because, Texas is odds favorite to win the championship for some of the folks out in Vegas. They're in that conversation. But you now have seen how special a good culture can be when you hear from Fernando Mendoza, the Heisman Trophy winner, on down, just what it means to unite as a team. And they literally were an elite team. Listen to Curt Cignetti talking about this. Curt Cignetti on when he's recruiting what he's looking for. It's not stars. He's looking for football players.
I've never been into stars. Just never have been. Was a recruiting coordinator for about 20 years as well as a coach. I think the evaluation is extremely important, and there's a lot of good players out there, and you find the guy that's got the right stuff, good habits, and wants to be great, and you develop them. That's part of the job of the program.
All right, so Curt Cignetti, and that look, no one's sitting here saying that the guys they brought in aren't going to be we guys, right? And hopefully they vetted that on the recruiting trail. And guys want to come play with Arch Manning at Texas and want to unite and try to win a national championship. It's not just about the paycheck, but in this new world order, that concerns you, right? Mm-hmm. If you were chasing, because by all accounts, Cam Coleman was one of the most expensive player in the non-quarterback in the portal. But by all the reporting I've seen, he didn't take the highest offer. The most money was not offered by Texas. Now he's making pretty good money from the Longhorns, but it wasn't the biggest deal. Which would tell you that, okay, that's where I want to be. It was all about the dollars. And we told you that Auburn made him an offer to make him a top 5 player in the country. And so he wanted to play where he could be in a great offense and showcase himself for the next level. I think that that's interesting. All right, so that's where we're at. That's where Texas is. They're going to head into their winter workouts. There still could be some portal additions that we'll tell you about. Longhorns roster pretty much set. How confident are you, Jack Farrell, that the culture can meet the talent for the Longhorns? Is that your biggest concern?
I mean, yeah, anything can happen when you bring in like half a new team, but I think the leaders in place are the leaders in place, and in that regard, I'm not worried about it.
Okay, well, that's going to be something to follow. And to your point about the leaders in place, part of this was they were very young last year, and their best players were very young. You were talking about Wingo and Arch and Colin Simmons and on down the line. Those guys are a year seasoned, and now you're trying to maximize their next year, which likely is the final year for Cam Coleman, Arch Manning, Colin Simmons, because if they play up to their potential, they're 3 years and off to the NFL. Arch Manning would be 2 years as a starter, and they'll be in the NFL draft in 2027.